Mike Berners-Lee is here with me. He is the author of the books How Bad Are Bananas? The Carbon Footprint of Everything, which came out in 2010, and The Burning Question, which was published in 2013. We are here to discuss the latter book, which Mike wrote with Duncan Clark. First of all, could you tell us briefly about your book, The Burning Question? What is the premise of this book? Why did you write it?
Well, The Burning Question is a big picture perspective on climate change, and we wrote it out of a sense that if you stood right back from the climate change problem, further back from it than most people who are engaged with it ever really get to stand, you see some things which are so important that you realise that actually we can't deal with the climate change problem sensibly at all unless we fully grasp them. And yet it struck Duncan and I that they were largely being missed from the political agenda and even missed from the agenda of most people who are engaged with climate change on any level.
That's an interesting point. In the green debate, we have grown used to the idea of scarcity, of limited resources, an idea that was popularized in the highly influential book Limits to Growth from 1972. Now, part of one of your book is called A Problem of Abundance. That is a new way of thinking about resources. What exactly is the problem?
Well, the problem is that as we burn fossil fuel, it sends carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And the rate at which we've been burning fossil fuel has been growing mathematically exponentially since 1850. With almost no trace of any dents in that mathematically exponential curve at all. And if you look at the amount of fossil fuel that there is in the ground waiting to be dug up and burned, it's absolutely enormous. And what the science is telling us is that if we were to burn even a small proportion of that, our climate we would precipitate a level of climate change that would be very likely to be extremely serious for humanity. So the problem of abundance is that there is actually so much fuel in the ground that we need urgently to voluntarily agree at a global level to leave the vast majority of it in the ground for all time.
You also address the way in which efforts to reduce fossil fuels often get cancelled out at the global system level, and you compare it to the act of squeezing a balloon. Can you explain the idea behind this metaphor?
Well, local actions that we take in any one place in the world, even at a national level, like, for example, I come from the UK where we've got national targets to cut our emissions and we're succeeding in meeting them. The trouble is that they get cancelled out at the global system level by emissions elsewhere growing to compensate for our cuts. So it is like squeezing a balloon. So it's like the UK is squeezing its part of its balloon in, but it's just popping up elsewhere. So we're having more of our goods made in other countries elsewhere in the world, and their emissions are rising in order to meet our consumption needs. So it's just another part of the balloon is expanding. So what we need is some way in which we can squeeze every part of the balloon at once, so that otherwise another part will just pop out to compensate.
Okay, so obviously we're not succeeding. But what are the social, economic, and political barriers to, cutting fossil fuel use?
Well, let's look at some economic ones first of all. So there's an awfully large amount of financial vested interest in some parts of the economy in keeping a fossil burning system going. So the value of the fossil fuel assets that are in the ground and all the infrastructure that's with it is somewhere between 20 and 50 trillion dollars. It's very hard to estimate it exactly, but it's an enormous amount of money. And if we're going to leave the fuel in the ground, we're going to have to write off those fossil fuel assets. And understandably, that's worrying for the fossil fuel companies. But it's interestingly, what's often not seen as clearly is the financial opportunity that exists for other companies in having a low carbon world. So, for example, very, very obviously in the renewables industries there are opportunities, but it's much more far-reaching than that. Any business that's in the that delivers goods or services in an efficient way is going to be advantaged by a low-carbon world. So IT businesses, telecommunications businesses, everyone who's into doing things, delivering utility for less resource use is going to find that their services are at a premium in a low-carbon world. So there's opportunity as well as risk on the economic side, but it requires some new thinking. So that's the economic barriers. The political barriers are tied to the economic barriers. It's to do with politicians not being imaginative and brave enough to sell a vision for a new kind of future. And it's also politicians being under the power of vested interests of the fossil fuel industry. And socially, the social barriers are to do with rigid thinking and existing habits about how we live, which we assume, it's all too easy to assume, can't be changed or can only be changed by foregoing some of the things that we love most in life. And actually we haven't spent enough time and effort working up and imagining and properly getting excited about the opportunities that exist for living better, enjoying life more, having a more exciting time at the same time as not trashing the planet. So there's new thinking required in all those three areas, and we just need to put it all together and understand properly how it can all be made to work.
And, from your book it's clear it's not just fossil fuel that is driving the climate change. What other factors come into play?
Well, fossil fuel accounts for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions, but there are other important greenhouse gases as well, not least nitrous oxide and methane. And most of those emissions come from the food system. And in dealing with the fossil fuels, we need to deal with the food system as well. And that raises a whole lot of new challenges, but also a lot of opportunity. So the reason that we're trying to deal with climate change is because we think it's strongly in the interests of humanity. And so there'll be no point in dealing with fossil fuel whilst letting everybody starve, or sacrificing our biodiversity, or trashing the planet in any other way through our land system. So we need to deal with all this together. Now, the good news in the land system is that we're currently growing about 3 times the calorific output that we need for our species. And we're wasting most of it. We're wasting 2/3 of it through leaving food in the ground if the market decides it doesn't need it anymore, letting it rot, wasting it in households, and also by feeding a lot of it to animals so that we can have meat and dairy, and a rising trend in meat and dairy consumption. And actually we don't need to all go vegetarian, but we do need to curb the global trend for increased meat production. So there's an awful lot of opportunity in that. And also there are opportunities to improve the productivity of our food systems and the way that we grow food, whilst improving biodiversity. There are massive opportunities to be had out there. And if we really get it right, there's even an opportunity to feed a growing population properly and in a healthy and tasty way, whilst leaving spare capacity for a really significant increase in biofuel production. And we need to get that right, because if we just let biofuels go crazy and let market forces do their thing with biofuels when we curb the fossil fuel coming out of the ground, we would have a humanitarian disaster, almost certainly, in food, land that should be used for human crop production, getting diverted to more lucrative biofuels. So we need to manage that, and now would be a very good time for the world to get onto that agenda in advance of a global carbon constraint. But if we play it right, we can have biofuels for flying, for example, whilst feeding everybody, whilst doing a better job with biodiversity than we are at the moment. It's I'm not saying it's an easy problem, but it's a very solvable problem.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you say it's now is the time to do something about it. So what can we do? You talk about 6 steps that will help tackle the climate change. Can you tell us about those 6 steps?
Okay, well, in one sense, everything around the fossil fuel tracks back to we need to have a global constraint on fossil fuel coming out of the ground. And it needs to be a strong global agreement to reduce the rate of extraction rapidly and cut it to zero within a few decades' time. And it doesn't matter how hard you think it is to come up with that deal. We absolutely have to have it. So we may as well focus hard on bringing that about. And so a lot of other things become a question of how do they contribute to creating the conditions under which such a deal becomes possible. So the second point that we make in the book, the second thing that needs to happen is our species needs to wake up. We all, the public, the politicians, the business leaders, the scientists, everybody needs to wake up to the climate change threat. And I don't just mean waking up at a head level, I mean waking up at a heart level. I mean emotionally engaged strongly with it. And we found that very, very difficult. And there are various explanations for why it's been so difficult. It's a complex, abstract problem. It affects people on the other side of the world. It's a futuristic problem. And there are lots of things about the nature of the climate change problem that have caught us off balance. And we need to understand how to engage properly and emotionally with that challenge in order to bring about the conditions under which politicians understand that their political careers depend on fighting hard for the kind of climate change deal that we really need. And linked to all of that, there's been a void in leadership. So our children will look back on the global leaders of today and will ask themselves what on earth they were playing at. And they'll ask why the people of the world put up with it. Put up with a situation where we knew climate change was happening and we allowed leaders and we voted for leaders who weren't dealing with it. I mean, I think they will really scratch their heads and wonder at our inadequacy if we don't insist on better leadership now.
I mean, do you think this has to do in any way with the idea of progress? I mean, progress as a metaphor or a progress as a way of thinking, progress as a way of justifying wasteful behavior? I mean, can we in some way reimagine progress?
Well, a very interesting question is how much do we need to reimagine? Can we just get the right deals in place around the world and then carry on with our attitude to life and our way of doing the economy in a broadly kind of similar way? Or do we need to reinvent humankind's whole approach to progress and life and ambition and consumption? And so we're on an exponential emissions curve, but actually our species is on a few exponential curves. We're on one on nitrogen use and phosphorus use and resource depletion in all sorts of ways, and all kinds of ways in which we're pushing the limits of our planet. And so one big question is, do we need to think in new ways about our whole approach to the environment that we're in? So in terms of progress, well, we've progressed in terms of innovation and technology in enormous ways, very, very rapidly. And we assume that that's all good. And in some ways it is very good. So, you and I are both 50 and hopefully we're not too far from the ends of our lives, and we probably would be, not that many decades ago. So there's undoubtedly a good side to all of that. But with all this technological innovation that we've got, come a whole lot of other types of progress that we need to develop simultaneously. And that's about global stewardship. And that's about, as our power as a species over the natural environment grows ever stronger and stronger, we need to develop the capability to be careful with that and be responsible with that and to empathize with things that we're capable of destroying if we don't empathize with them. So there's a whole other kind of progress that we need. In a way, we need to rebalance our evolution. We've evolved technologically incredibly, but we haven't necessarily evolved in our way in which we think about the planet. So in a way, one way of looking at it is in terms of circles of influence and circles of concern. Our circle of influence has grown massively, but our circle of concern needs to grow at the same speed, otherwise we become irresponsible.
Mm-hmm. At first glance, one could argue that, you and Duncan Clark, you do not try to be too optimistic in your book, but you still wrote the book, and which suggests there is still hope for us, and we still have a fighting chance. And was this in some ways a difficult balancing act to write a book where you have to show the danger, but still leave some room for hope?
I don't believe in playing games over what the picture is or how optimistic to feel. I don't believe in painting unrealistic pictures in order to manipulate opinion in certain ways or motivate in certain ways. I don't think that helps. I don't think it builds trust. I think it's important to just say it absolutely how it is. And I don't believe in faking optimism. I believe in if there's so the bad side to that is you hear difficult messages from Duncan and I, and the good side to that is that if I say that there are things to be optimistic about, I mean it. It's genuine. And as it happens, I feel considerably more optimistic than I think either of us felt when we wrote the book. In fact, I think we both do. And we wrote the book because you're right. We felt that we weren't at the point of giving up yet. But it did feel as though the world wasn't listening. And when the book was published, I remember saying, I don't want to spend the next 5 years just complaining that nobody's listening. And that's not going to be my script, thank you. And I'm very pleased to be able to say that I don't feel that the world isn't listening at all anymore. I feel as though the world is beginning to listen. I feel as though the right sort of conversations are starting to happen. I think it is encouraging that China and the US are starting to put things on the table. They're not anything like enough, but they are the right kinds of things. So it feels as though 2 years ago, the world was just didn't even understand the levers to pull properly. It feels as though we are getting to understand the right levers now, and we're fiddling around with them. And what we need to do is collectively agree to pull those levers hard now. So in one sense, we're miles away because what's on the table will curb emissions slightly, possibly, but it won't keep the temperature rise to within a level that is at all acceptable for humanity. But on the other hand, it's a game changer because we've never succeeded in denting that emissions curve before. So if we can dent it a bit, that tells us that if we just did more of the same, a lot more of the same, and got China and the US and the EU and all the other countries to raise their game a long way from what's already on the table, in the same way that they're talking about, but just more of it, then we really could get there. Well, that's a step change for me. It can be a short amount of time between a situation in which nobody's listening, the culture feels totally stuck, the politics feels stuck, the economics feels stuck, and it just looks as though we're doomed. You see a few cracks, you see the beginnings of some change, you see some things that you start to look as though they might be more hopeful. It could be a very short space of time, if we all push hard, from there to a situation in which the culture is turning on its head, the politics are turning on its head, the economics are turning on its head, and suddenly we're all fighting for we're all gunning for a low-carbon world like crazy. That is a possibility.
That's actually a fine way to end this interview. Thank you for taking time to discuss your book.
Pleasure.